Ani, my name is Christin Dennis. I'm First Nations of Canada. My Anishinaabe name is Gijiaquat, which means fast moving cloud. I'm from the Chippewa Nation, and my reserve is Amjanong of Sarnia, and I'm a contemporary Native artist. I had a friend in Guelph who was a police officer. He had a buffalo farm. And I remember he says, "No, come photograph my buffalo." I said, "Sure, I'll jump on that one." And it was interesting because everyone ignored me. As if I didn't exist. They were all eating, as if it didn't really matter, except for the two that were standing there. They would not eat. They watched every movement that I did. They just looked. They wouldn't eat. I just remember I was just being awestruck taking this photograph and feeling really humbled at the same time that these magnificent creatures were allowing me to photograph them. You'll see the four directions, the four red, yellow, black, and white of the symbols and metallics are actually representing the four races. On the medicine wheel, we have the red, yellow, black, and white, and that represents the four races. Also, the four directions, the four seasons, the four aspects of who we are, and the four animals that are. I mean, the medicine wheel is our Bible, and it's not just a pretty wheel of the four colors. It's actually a teaching tool to help our children and our generations to understand the processes of life. And so you'll see in my works a lot of the four directions always being represented. The little squiggly line is living in balance. Those are yin yang, the native yin yang, and that it's the positive, the negative, the line that we have to walk. And even though there's the positive and negative, you need those in order to experience life and to understand and to grow with wisdom. And so, without the positive and the negative, you would just be spirit floating, knowing who you are already. That's no fun. When we're people, when we come into this life, we come into an experience of not knowing, and then that's the experience of learning and to experience who we are, and which creates wisdom and knowledge. We believe that when we die, that all our wisdom and knowledge go into the ground, into the stone people, which are the grandmothers and grandfathers, which when we do sweat lodges, we call them the stone people. When we heat the stones, we put them inside the lodge. And that's the wisdom and knowledge of our ancestors. So imagine these stones are millions of years old, so they hold a lot of knowledge and wisdom. The barbed wire, I remember doing that barbed wire. I put that in there because we've sectionalized ourselves. When we sectionalize our animals, we're sectionalizing ourselves as well. And unfortunately, that's where we are today. That's the process of generational experience that we had to sectionalize some of the land in order for the animals to have their own piece of land, because we're imposing everywhere. And so without it sectionalizing these pieces of the land, we would lose probably a lot of the land if we didn't do that. We have to try and preserve conservation for not only the animals, but also for ourselves too. I think this piece is probably one of the most powerful pieces. All my work is powerful, but this one here in particular, World Without End. When I was creating this art, I was under the influence of other artists. I had finished my college in fine arts. I majored in fine arts and minored in graphic arts. I remember they didn't really teach any of the native art and their art history. They had everything else, and I hope that's changed today. Back then, there was nothing about First Nations art, but I had to study all the European art. And I remember I wanted to be a native artist, and I didn't know what that encompassed. So I started studying Norval Morrisseau's work, and I fell in love with his work. His work was just incredible. And same with Carl Ray. Carl Ray was one of the first, and so was Norval. And they both, when they first started doing their stuff, they were doing birch bark drawings, and they weren't allowed to do that. And the elders said, you can't do that. And what just changed today, because we went through a period of our time where, we couldn't practice our own traditions, and a lot of our traditions went underground. And we couldn't even do sun dances. We couldn't do sweat lodges. We couldn't even dance our own dances. They would, back in the 1800s, they would consider that as an uproaring. I remember studying Norval Morrisseau's work, and also Michael Robinson's work. There's another Canadian who's passed on. And a lot of these greats have passed on. Carl Bean was one of them for sure. And I started studying their work. And when I started coming out of college and trying to become a native artist, I ended up drawing their work. I ended up copying their work without realizing this is what I was doing. It kind of baffled me. And I says, I can't sell this as my work because it looks like someone else's work. And I think you come to a place where you can actually sell your work even if it does look like someone else's work, you're influenced by someone else's work. But I didn't want that. If you look at my work, it doesn't look like anybody else's work. And back then, I shook a lot. That was because I'm an alcoholic, and I haven't drank for 20 some odd years. And because I shook all the time, my lines weren't perfect. And I thought, well, you know what? It's time for me to think about that, incorporate my shake. And if you look at that art, you'll see those lines aren't smooth, they're shaky. And so I incorporated that into my art. And I thought, you know what? I'm just going to take these pieces of paper. And I did it with this one. I think this was actually the first one that I did it with. I took a stroke like this, and I went like this on the piece of paper. And I says, that's not a mistake. That's a prelude to the next where I'm going with it. And that's why you see it going all over the place. And I thought, wow. And I started creating, I started shading, I started just allowing the spirit to work through me rather than my head getting in the way. And, you can get into your head and you think, oh, it's all about technique and stuff like that. And I thought, well, I already have the technique. I've been given the knowledge. And in order for me to have the knowledge, I have to experience the knowledge. And so I started experiencing. I got my head out of the way and just allowed the knowledge to flow and allow spirit to flow through me. And that's what created this piece. And I started looking at it, and it baffled me. It was like, the more I did it, the more I was just moved by it. And I thought, wow. And so when I did this, and this is probably the beginning of my process of creating my own pieces of art. And the world without end is also the death of the spirit people, that when we die, nothing dies. It transitions and it's transformed, and it goes into the process of recreating itself. We talk about the 7 generations of who we are, and the 7 generations is who I am today. The last 7 generations is what's made me today. Whether I'm the victim of the last 7 generations, I'm also the person responsible to make the change for the next 7 generations. And if I don't make that process change, then I'll come back again and probably relive something in order for me to relearn and to rebirth myself in order to move to that process. And yet I'm not alone in that process of recreating the 7 generations, because you're not alone. And as an example is the death of our last generations of the children at residential schools, that they died and were buried without name, and nobody was told, unmarked graves. I'm saying this because it's because of those children and the understanding that their death isn't in vain, that they brought attention to the First Nations people of of North America, the indigenous people of North America, that we're still here. We're still trying to live in a sacred way, not in a way that we're trying to capture the old traditions of living on the plains and stuff. We know that's not going to happen. We just want to be able to practice the traditions that, and the culture of who we are. And I think that's what the children, the residential schools have made known, that they tried to live in that way, and it was taken away from them. And it was taken away from me because I'm a 60 scoop survivor. If you don't know what a 60 scoop survivor is, a person that instead of going to the residential schools, they were adopting us out into a community. And that's what happened to me. And I lost a lot of my culture. And the pieces that you actually see is the remembering. And when I say remembering, I just think of it as and then membering my culture back to me, and embracing it and putting it back into myself to hold and to nurture. And that's what these pieces of art are doing.